we could spend hours digging into all of the times and the ways and the places where the Messiah to come appears in the book of Psalms. He is everywhere, Jesus to come in the Psalms. It is, other than maybe Isaiah and Zechariah, it is probably the most messianic rich text to be found, and maybe even the most in terms of how much is said about the Messiah. Again, it would take way too much time to dig deep into it, but just to give an overview, just to kind of show and to illustrate just how much he's there. Right off the bat, off the top of my head, Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," which is such a general statement about God. You could apply it to the Father. It doesn't have to be messianic. But Jesus himself addresses calls himself the Good Shepherd. And so if he was making that connection deliberately or not, I don't know. But it certainly is a connection that I have in my head. But if you want something more direct, that's Psalm 23. You go back a psalm. The most overt, perhaps, is Psalm 22. The whole of Psalm 22 is a picture of the crucifixion scene. The psalm begins with, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from hearing the words of my roaring?" That is David expressing his feelings that God has abandoned him, his thinking that God has rejected him. And those words will be echoed by Jesus, quoted by the Lord when he's on the cross. As you go through Psalm 22, you find even more references. David talks about how he's been stripped naked, laid bare, and surrounded by his enemies, which will exactly happen to Jesus. David talks about how he has been pierced in his hands and his feet, which of course happens to Jesus. David talks about the feeling of shame that has come over him as a result of all this, which of course is echoed by Jesus. But then at the end of the psalm, the positive ending is that David says, "But I have not been abandoned." I open the psalm in verse 1 by saying, "God, why have you forsaken me?" But I end the psalm, roughly the ending, around verse 24, saying, "I have not been abandoned." God has not rejected his people. God heard the cries of his child. And that, of course, is certainly the case with Jesus on the cross. That's just one psalm. That's just Psalm 22. You have the resurrection text from Psalm 16, which for the entirety of the Old Testament history, Jews and rabbis believed that David was talking about himself. But of course, that's impossible, as as Peter points out in Acts chapter 2, that David wasn't talking about himself, because in Psalm 16, David says, "You won't leave my body in the grave. My flesh will not see corruption." And Peter points out, you can go dig up David right now. His body has seen corruption. It is in the grave. His bones are all that's left. But someone else was in the grave and came out of the grave uncorrupted. Someone else did not stay in the grave. And that, of course, is the Messiah, Jesus. You have the reference to Jesus as someone who carries on the priesthood of Melchizedek in Psalm 110. You have Jesus referenced as the begotten Son of God in Psalm chapter 2. You have Jesus as the holy friend of David in Psalm chapter 41. You have perhaps most poignantly in Psalm 31, David utters the words, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." That's kind of a paraphrasing. In fact, that's the Lord's paraphrasing. "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit" is the last thing that Jesus said before he dies. And those words came from David in Psalm 31, verse 5. And those words from David in Psalm 31 were used and taught to children. That was kind of the bedtime prayer that they were taught. When you have to teach a child how to pray, well, you teach them to memorize Psalm 31. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," or some equivalent thereof. And so it's very emotional to think about our Master on the cross as he's suffered and bled and he's about to die, and his final words are this bedtime prayer that he probably learned from his mother, but were taken from Psalm 31. So all over the Psalms, and that's just scratching the surface, but all over the Psalms, you can find reference to the Christ. It really is a messianic saturated series of poems.